I always hated the quiet on Artemis 12. It wasn't like the silence of a library, where there's at least a subtle buzz of life. No, this was a void where every small sound was amplified and twisted into something foreign. The constant background noise of the station was all we had. It didn't help much. But today was different. Today, the noise of the station was drowned out by the zero-point reactor coming online for the first time. We had done it. After months of simulations, endless calculations, and more arguments than I cared to count, Zero Point was live, and it was working. For the first time since we'd been stationed out here, I felt a surge of hope, the kind that comes from knowing you're on the edge of something that could change everything. I leaned back in my chair, eyes glued to the monitor displaying the energy output. Numbers I'd only dreamed of seeing in real time were now right in front of me. Infinite power, just waiting for us to harness it. Lane and Pike were hovering nearby, watching as the data rolled in, their faces reflecting the same cautious optimism. "So far, so good," Pike muttered, tapping away on his handheld device. His eyes flicked between his readouts and the reactor through the reinforced glass window. Pike was practical, methodical, and the kind of guy who didn't get excited about much. He always acted like the only thing that mattered was making sure the station didn't blow up. "Carter!" Lane's voice cut through my thoughts. She was standing by the reactor console, arms crossed, her face a mask of skepticism. "We're getting initial results, but it's too early to call this a success. The reactor's barely at 1% capacity." I glanced at her, pushing down the frustration bubbling in my chest. Lane had been the cautious one since day one, always worrying about safety protocols, always wanting more time. "It's working, isn't it?" I replied. "No anomalies, no malfunctions. We've made history here today." Lane didn't look convinced. She glanced at Pike for support, but he just shrugged. It was too early to know if we'd really done it, and she knew it. But still, I wasn't going to let her caution spoil the moment. I turned back to the console, watching as the numbers continued to stabilize. Everything was perfect, better than perfect. We'd tapped into something no one else had ever been able to reach, and soon the world would know it. The corporation, the board, hell, the entire planet, they'd have no choice but to acknowledge our success. And this would be only the beginning. A small beeping sound snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the display, just a minor fluctuation in the reactor's output. Nothing serious. I adjusted a few parameters and the numbers evened out. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "See what?" Pike asked, not bothering to look up. "Small fluctuation, nothing critical, just odd." Lane stepped closer to my station, eyes narrowing at the monitor. "There shouldn't be any fluctuations this early. We're at minimal capacity." "It's within expected ranges," I said, waving her off. "Probably a glitch in the monitoring system. Nothing to worry about." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. I knew she was thinking about all the safety protocols we'd bypassed to speed things up. But what did she expect? We weren't going to sit on our hands while the rest of the galaxy raced ahead. We ran a few more diagnostics, but everything checked out. The fluctuation didn't return, and the reactor continued humming along without issue. Pike muttered something about checking the containment seals, then drifted off to another part of the room, leaving me and Lane in the awkward silence we'd grown so used to over the past few months. "I don't like it," she said after a long pause. "It feels too smooth. Nothing this new works perfectly on the first try." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Lane was always like this, never happy unless she had something to fix. "You're just not used to things going right," I said with a smirk. "Relax." She didn't smile back. I was about to say something else when a sudden shift happened. One second I was staring at the monitor, and the next, I wasn't. It was like blinking, except I hadn't blinked. I looked around, confused. The room felt different. Lane was still standing there, but she wasn't facing me anymore. She was a few steps to the side, looking at the reactor. "Lane?" I called out. She turned to me, frowning. "What?" I opened my mouth to explain, but stopped myself. What was I even going to say? That something had shifted? That I'd lost a few seconds? No, it sounded ridiculous. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. Never mind. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press it. I watched as she turned back to the reactor, her attention shifting again to the numbers on her screen. I stared at my own console, but my heart was beating faster now. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. We'd been running on little sleep for weeks. It was bound to mess with my head sooner or later. But then, on the monitor, the reactor output spiked. The fluctuation returned, larger this time. I leaned in, tapping the screen, trying to get a better reading, but before I could adjust anything, the numbers shifted back to normal. "Pike!" I called out. He appeared from behind a workstation, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. "What?" "Another fluctuation, a big one this time." He frowned, walking over to check the data. Lane joined him, eyes scanning the numbers as quickly as they appeared. "It's still within tolerances," Pike muttered, scratching his chin. "But yeah, it's weird." "Weird isn't good," Lane said sharply. "We should shut it down and figure out what's causing this." I stared at them both, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Something about the fluctuation felt wrong. Not in a technical sense. It wasn't dangerous, not yet. But it felt off. Like the reactor wasn't just spitting out random numbers. It was like it was doing something we couldn't see. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. Let's not overreact. We can keep monitoring. We'll run a full diagnostic tonight, but there's no reason to shut down. We moved through the rest of the day with the tension hanging over us. I kept watching the monitors, waiting for another anomaly, but nothing happened. The reactor hummed along, smooth as ever. By the time I left the control room, my nerves were fried. As I walked back to my quarters and closed the door behind me, the silence felt even more intense now that I was alone. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing in particular, still thinking about that fluctuation, still thinking about how those seconds had disappeared earlier. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down I knew. Something had shifted. I don't know when I first realized things had gotten worse. The days had started blending together. We were working so hard, running diagnostics, tweaking parameters and monitoring the reactor, that I barely noticed time slipping away. But when it started happening again, I couldn't ignore it. It was 3 days after the first test. Lane was on the same cycle as me, working through her numbers with the same focus she always had. Pike was off shift, taking a break in the crew quarters, and the station felt quieter than usual. And then it happened. 1 second, I was typing a status report on the reactor's energy output. Everything was looking stable, no spikes or fluctuations since that first one. And the next, my hands were just sitting on the console. The report was finished. I stared at the screen, confused. I hadn't typed the last 2 paragraphs. I was sure of it. "Lane," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. I glanced over at her, but she was too engrossed in her own screen to look up. Did I just finish this report?" She looked up, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't remember finishing it. 1 second, I was typing, and now it's done." Lane stared at me for a long moment. I could see the doubt forming in her eyes. "You've been working non-stop for days, Carter. You're probably just tired. Your mind's playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe that, but something in the back of my mind told me otherwise. I stared at the report, trying to retrace my steps, but I couldn't. It was like there was a gap in my memory, like I'd blinked and skipped ahead. "Forget it," I muttered, more to myself than to her. I saved the report and leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face. "I'll take a break soon. Just let me finish the last diagnostics run." Lane didn't press it. She was cautious, but she wasn't a fool. She knew how much pressure we were all under. And maybe she figured I wasn't worth arguing with. Later that same day, we were monitoring the reactor's containment field. making sure everything was still within normal limits. Lane was running the numbers. Pike had returned, quietly tapping away on his own console. Things felt normal, at least as normal as they could in the middle of deep space with a reactor capable of tearing holes in the fabric of reality. I was reading over the reactor's cooling system report when it happened again. 1 second I was standing there, eyes fixed on the data. The next, I was sitting down. Pike was saying something, but his voice was distorted, like I was hearing it through water. "Did you see that? Lane, you seeing this?" Lane's voice snapped back into focus. "I saw it. The energy output spiked, another fluctuation, but bigger this time." I blinked, disoriented. "Wait, what just happened?" "You missed it," Pike said, his voice edged with frustration. "The reactor's output just shot up again, like last time, but worse. This time it didn't reset to baseline, it's like it wants to keep climbing." "How long?" I asked, trying to get my bearings. "How long was I out?" Lane stared at me, eyes narrowing. "Out? What are you talking about?" I stopped. How could I explain it? How could I tell them I felt like I'd lost minutes, like I'd just skipped ahead in time? It sounded insane. But I knew I wasn't wrong. I wasn't imagining this. I don't remember the last few minutes. It's like I jumped ahead. 1 second I was standing, then I was sitting. I didn't sit down. I didn't even move. Pike and Lane exchanged a look. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and I could see the worry settling into their expressions. "Carter," Lane said carefully, "we've been monitoring the reactor the whole time. There was a fluctuation, but nothing like what you're describing." "It's not just the reactor," I said, standing up too quickly. My hands were shaking, though I tried to hide it. "Something's wrong with time. I'm losing time, and it's not just me, the reactor, the station. Something's happening here." Pike shook his head. "You're tired, you're probably overworked. We've all been seeing things." "No, this isn't fatigue, I know what I'm saying." I could hear the desperation in my own voice now. "This isn't normal. This isn't a glitch in the reactor. I think we're tapping into something we don't understand." "Carter," Lane started, but I cut her off. "We need to run a full diagnostic on the station, not just the reactor. Something's wrong with the entire system, maybe even more than that." Lane hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Okay, we'll run it." Pike muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. I could tell he was frustrated, probably thought I was losing it, but he knew better than to ignore me when I was this worked up. We started the diagnostic, monitoring every system on Artemis 12. Life support, communications, AI functions, everything. But as the data poured in, it all looked normal. No malfunctions, no errors. Everything was within normal parameters. Except for one thing. "Cerberus," I called out to the station AI. "What's the status on the anomaly reports for today?" The AI responded in its usual monotone voice. "Anomalies detected, none." "None," Lane repeated, glancing over at me. "That can't be right." "Cerberus, what about the reactor fluctuations from earlier?" I asked. "Reactor output is stable. No fluctuations detected." I stared at the console. "That's impossible. We just saw one." "Pike, you saw it too." Pike nodded slowly. "Yeah, we all saw it. The data was right there." "Cerberus, check again. Review the logs from the last 24 hours. Reactor output stable. No anomalies detected." This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a glitch. Something was wrong. Something deeper than we could see. "We need to figure this out," Lane said quietly. "We can't keep running these experiments without knowing what's going on." Pike crossed his arms, staring at the monitor like it had betrayed him. "I'll check the physical systems again. Maybe there's a hardware malfunction somewhere. Could be screwing with the logs." I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue. At this point, any answer was better than the silence we were left with. Lane turned to me, her eyes narrowing with the same intensity she always had when she was about to push back. "Carter, I'm serious. We need to shut it down, at least until we figure out what's happening." "No." My response was immediate, firm. I wasn't ready to give up, not when we were this close. We're still within safe limits. These anomalies, whatever they are, don't pose any immediate threat to the station. Her jaw clenched, and for a second I thought she might argue. But then she sighed, shaking her head. Fine. But if we see one more fluctuation, we're done. Agreed? I didn't like it, but I nodded. Agreed. We spent the rest of the day in a tense silence, running more tests, but nothing else happened. No fluctuations, no skipped time, no strange sensations. Everything seemed back to normal. The silence between us had grown thicker over the past few days. Pike, Lane, and I barely spoke unless it was about the reactor, and even those conversations were short, tense exchanges that felt more like obligations than discussions. The anomalies had become impossible to ignore, time skips, repeated moments, even objects that seemed to vanish and reappear, but no one wanted to acknowledge the truth. I had spent most of the day at my station, monitoring the reactor's output. My body was heavy with exhaustion, my mind working on autopilot as I sifted through the data for the 100th time. Lane was across the room, quiet as always, her eyes glued to the monitor in front of her. Pike sat near the reactor controls, his expression tight. It felt like we were waiting for something, though none of us knew what. Carter, Lane's voice cut through the stillness, soft but serious. I've been going over the reactor's data logs again, and there's something I need to show you. I turned to look at her, a sinking feeling in my gut. Lane rarely spoke, unless she had something concrete. She wasn't the type to speculate. She walked over to my console and tapped a few commands into the terminal, pulling up a series of charts and numbers that, to the untrained eye, would have looked like a mess of meaningless data. But I could see the patterns right away. Spikes, dips, fluctuations, nothing that matched what we should have been seeing from a stable energy source. This isn't random noise, it's a pattern, and it's coming from somewhere outside the reactor. The energy levels aren't fluctuating because of a malfunction. They're being influenced by something we're connected to. I frowned, leaning in to study the data. What are you saying? She paused, glancing at Pike, who had moved closer to listen. I think 0 Point is linked to another dimension. Every time we activate the reactor, it's like we're opening a door, tapping into a parallel universe that operates under different physical laws. That's why we've been seeing these anomalies. The reactor is pulling energy from this other dimension, but it's also destabilizing our reality in the process. I stared at her, her words settling in. A parallel dimension. It wasn't theoretical anymore. We had tapped into something that was bleeding into our world. And if we keep pushing it, she continued, we're going to rip that door wide open. Pike let out a slow breath, his eyes darting between us. So what do we do? Shut it down? Lane nodded. We have to. If we don't, we could be looking at a full-on collapse of the station, maybe worse. For a long moment, none of us said anything. Finally, I nodded. We shut it down. Pike was already moving toward the reactor controls. Lane pulled up the shutdown procedure on her terminal, her eyes narrowing as she read through the steps. This was it, the end of the project, the end of everything we'd worked for. But as the reactor began to power down, something went wrong. Pike frowned, his hands pausing over the controls. It's not shutting down. I turned toward the reactor, my pulse quickening. The hum was still there, the steady low vibration that had become so familiar. What do you mean, it's not shutting down? I mean, the reactor isn't responding. I've initiated the shutdown sequence, but nothing's happening. Lane approached, checking her terminal. That's impossible. It should be powering down right now. The energy levels aren't dropping. They're increasing. I moved to the reactor console, staring at the numbers. She was right. The energy output was climbing again, even faster than before. The reactor wasn't shutting down. It was feeding off something else. Cut the power. Sever the connection to the reactor. If it's not responding to the shutdown sequence, we'll kill the power manually. Pike nodded and moved to the power controls, flipping the switches to cut the reactor's power source. But nothing changed. The hum persisted. The numbers on the screen continued to rise. It's still running, Pike muttered, staring at the console in disbelief. It's not even connected to the power grid anymore. How is that possible? Lane's theory flashed through my mind. The reactor was pulling energy from the parallel dimension. It didn't need our power source anymore. It had found something else to feed off. Lane, if the reactor is drawing power from the other dimension, we can't shut it down. It's feeding off the energy from that world. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on the reactor. The longer we keep the reactor running, the more we destabilize our reality. We have to find a way to stop it. I stared at the glowing core through the reinforced glass, the light pulsing like a heartbeat. We can try cutting off the cooling system, Pike suggested, though his voice was filled with doubt. Without it, the reactor will overheat, might trigger an emergency shutdown. It's worth a shot, I said, though I didn't believe it. We disabled the cooling system, cutting off the flow of liquid nitrogen that kept the reactor stable. But as the temperature began to rise, the reactor didn't show any signs of slowing down. If anything, it seemed to thrive on the chaos, the energy output continuing to climb. It's not working, Lane said. The reactor isn't responding to anything we do. It's like it's not even part of this station anymore. The realization hit me. The reactor had crossed some invisible threshold. It was now a force that didn't obey our rules or our physics. We had opened a door to another world, and now we couldn't close it. Lane was right. We should have shut it down the moment we saw those first anomalies. But now it was too late. The reactor was beyond our control, and whatever was on the other side of that door was watching us. I felt it again, that presence. The sensation of being observed, studied, like we were an experiment that had gone wrong. And just for a moment, I thought I saw something in the reactor's glow. A shape, a figure. Lane and Pike were still talking, still trying to figure out a solution. But their voices felt distant, muffled. All I could do was stare at the reactor, at the impossible light that was spilling out into our world. Lane was still at the console, her fingers moving over the keys. Pike paced back and forth, muttering to himself, occasionally glancing toward the reactor chamber. I kept my eyes on the reactor's core, the light from it growing brighter. It wasn't light anymore. It was like the air around the core had started to warp, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The lines of the chamber twisted slightly, just enough to make me feel sick if I stared for too long. Pike finally stopped pacing. We're not getting out of this, are we? Lane didn't look up from her terminal. Not if we don't stop that reactor. We can't stop it, I said, my voice flat. It's pulling energy from the other side now. We've severed all our connections to it, but it's still running, feeding off whatever's in that dimension. Lane's fingers paused for a moment, then continued. We need to destroy it. If we can't shut it down, we'll have to blow the whole thing. The idea of destroying the reactor, of destroying everything we'd worked for, was unthinkable. But if we didn't destroy it, whatever was on the other side was going to come through. I turned to Pike, who was standing by the reactor's controls. Get the explosives. We'll rig the chamber, blow the whole thing. Pike didn't hesitate. He gave a short nod and disappeared down the corridor, leaving me and Lane in the control room. For a moment, neither of us moved. The quiet between us felt fragile, like the entire station was waiting for something to break. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow, barely visible in the reactor's glow. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when I turned my head, it didn't vanish. Instead, it shifted, slowly taking form, becoming more distinct, more there. The figure was tall, easily 8 feet, but its form was impossible to define. It was like looking at something half dissolved in water, its edges blurring and rippling, never quite solid. Its limbs stretched too far, its body thin, its movements slow, as if it was still figuring out how to exist in our world. It was standing in the reactor chamber, just beyond the reinforced glass, but its presence seeped into the room like a cold draft. The light from the reactor bent around it, warping, as if the figure was consuming the space around it. Lane hadn't noticed it yet, still focused on her screen, typing away. Lane, look. She turned slowly, following my gaze to the reactor chamber. Her hands stopped moving, her eyes widening as she saw the figure standing there. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trailing off. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, as though it were waiting, watching. But its form appeared flawed, as if it hadn't fully entered our dimension. Its limbs floated just above the ground, and there was a weightlessness to it, as though gravity didn't quite apply to it in the same way. Another figure appeared, this one just as tall, just as distorted, emerging from the glow of the reactor like a shadow peeling away from the light. Then another, and another. I felt my stomach drop. They were crossing into our world, one by one, drawn by the energy we had unleashed. The figures moved closer to the glass, their forms shifting, almost vibrating with the energy that surrounded them. They were vast, their presence filling the room with heaviness, as though the air had grown denser. Lane took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "They're not real, are they?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if they were real or not. All I knew was that they were here, standing just beyond the glass. "They're crossing over," I muttered. "We opened the door and now they're coming through." The figures shifted, their forms becoming more distinct, more tangible. They moved closer to the glass, their limbs twisting, reaching out as though testing the boundaries between our world and theirs. "Carter," Lane said quietly, her voice strained. "We need to go." We turned and hurried out of the room. I could feel the weight of their gaze on my back, like they were following us, tracking our every move. We reached the reactor chamber door just as Pike returned, a pack of explosives slung over his shoulder. He looked at the two of us, confusion flashing across his face. "What's going on?" "They're crossing over," I said, my voice tight. "The figures, they're coming through the reactor." Pike's face paled, but he didn't waste time asking questions. He handed me one of the charges, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We set these up around the chamber. Blow the whole thing. Hopefully it'll be enough to shut it down." I nodded, taking the explosives and moving toward the reactor. The figures were still there, visible through the glass, their forms shifting and twisting like they were made of smoke and light. They were closer now, their limbs brushing against the glass, as though they were testing it, trying to find a way through. As I placed the charge near the reactor's base, the figures studied me as if I were part of an experiment they were trying to understand. I glanced at Lane as she secured the final charge on the far side of the chamber. Pike stepped back after setting his own, his eyes locked on the reactor. We turned and headed for the exit, but as we reached the door, something made me stop. An overwhelming discomfort gripped me, as if the air had shifted around us. I turned back toward the reactor. The figures were still there, but now they were more solid, more here. And then one of them moved. It wasn't like a human movement. There was no sense of muscle or bone beneath the surface. The figure simply shifted, gliding through the reactor chamber like it was weightless, its form rippling as it passed through the light. It reached the glass, its massive hand pressing against the barrier. The glass cracked. I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure as it pressed harder against the glass, its form coming in and out of reality. The cracks spread, spider webbing across the surface. The barrier wasn't going to hold. The figures had grown more solid, as if they were learning how to exist in our world. Their massive, stretched forms seemed both alien and familiar, like distorted reflections of something human. They didn't walk, they hovered, their long limbs trailing just above the ground, as though the laws of gravity didn't quite apply to them. I gripped the small device tightly, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced at Lane and Pike. They were both tense. We had tried everything, cutting power, cutting the cooling to the reactor. Nothing worked. It had all come down to this: destroy the reactor and hope that whatever was on the other side didn't take us with it. I forced my breath to steady and looked down at the detonator in my hand. "Once I trigger this, we need to run. We don't know how big the blast will be." "Carter," Pike said, his voice low but urgent. "Just do it." I nodded, pressing the button. The charges detonated with a sound that was less an explosion and more a tearing, a deep, resonating rip. The ground shook violently, and the reactor core flashed, the blinding light swallowing everything in an instant. I blinked, struggling to adjust to the dim light. I was lying on the ground, dust and wreckage covering my body. I groaned as I pushed myself up, my head pounding. The reactor chamber, what was left of it, was a ruin. The once pristine walls were cracked and darkened with scorch marks. Metal beams hung at odd angles, twisted and broken. The reactor itself was gone, reduced to a crumpled, blackened husk. But more than that, everything felt different. The station had changed. "Lane? Pike?" A faint groan came from behind a pile of rubble, and I hurried over, pulling wreckage away. Pike was there, his face smeared with blood and dust, but alive. "You okay?" He coughed, nodding weakly. A few meters away, Lane was struggling to stand. She brushed dust off her clothes and staggered toward us, her eyes wide as she looked around the ruined chamber. "This isn't—" she started, but trailed off, her gaze fixed on something behind us. I turned, and I saw what had caught her attention. The figures. They were still there. But the reactor was destroyed. How could they still be here? They stood just beyond the wreckage, more solid now, more tangible. Their forms no longer shimmered at the edges like before. They were real, fully present, and something about them had changed. They were still massive, but now I could see details I hadn't noticed before. Twisted features, half-formed faces that seemed frozen in expressions of suffering. I backed away instinctively. "This doesn't make sense. The reactor—" "It's not the same station," Lane interrupted. "Look around." I blinked, taking in the full view of our surroundings for the first time. The walls were cracked, covered in layers of dust and rust, as if the station had been abandoned for decades. The equipment looked more advanced and corroded by time. This wasn't Artemis 12. "We're not in our world," Lane said. "We crossed over." The reality of it hit me. The blast hadn't killed us. It had thrown us into the parallel dimension, and the figures hadn't come through to our world. We had come to theirs. The figures were clearer now, their forms sharper. I saw the ragged remains of a uniform, barely clinging to one of the figures' limbs. The uniform was ours. "Those are us. Or what's left of us." Pike's face twisted in horror. "You're saying those things—" "They're from this dimension," Lane said, her voice clinical, though her eyes were wide with fear. "Our counterparts. They were here first. They tried to harness the energy just like we did. And this is what it did to them." I couldn't breathe. The figures, the versions of us, they glided through the ruined chamber, their twisted limbs brushing against the broken equipment, their empty eyes looking at us. "They're hunting us," I whispered. Lane turned to me. "We need to find a way out of here." But I knew, even as she said it, that there was no way out. The station, this version of it, was a burial ground, and we were trapped inside, hunted by the very things we had become. We scrambled through the halls of the ruined station, the air thick with dust and the remnants of what had once been our reality. Every corner we turned led us deeper into the twisted version of Artemis 12, where rusted metal groaned under the weight of decades of neglect. But no matter how far we ran, the figures were always there, moving with a quiet, eerie purpose. "We're not going to make it," Lane muttered as we ducked into a crumbling room that had once been the mess hall. The tables were overturned, the walls covered in grime, and the stale air was suffocating. As we caught our breath, I heard a faint, rasping whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was coming from the corridor we had just fled. I peeked around the corner and saw the figures, standing motionless at the far end, their empty eyes staring at nothing. They were waiting. "They're toying with us," I realized. "They could have caught us by now." "We're trapped," Pike whispered. "There's no way out." All I could do was watch as the figures began to move again, gliding down the corridor toward us, slow but inevitable. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't a hunt. This was a cycle, a repetition of what had already happened. The figures weren't killing us, they were preparing us to become them.